Okay, just a second here. Huh. All right. So this is why you always have a plan B. I had my presenter notes on here and now they're gone, but you know what? I was smart enough to print them off, so I have them all here. Well, just a quick introduction on myself before we go get into the topic today. I'm a principal with Baker Tilly. I'm a member of the firm's 420 person strong public sector group based in the Kansas City area. As some of you may have seen in the bio that was flashed on the screen earlier, I worked in various city management roles, mostly in the Kansas City area for about 20 years. Joined Baker Tilly doing consulting work for about 17 years ago, and work mostly in the area of public finance and economic development. Agenda for today, I'm going to talk about the various funding sources, the American Rescue Plan, of course, and then in addition to that, some potential changes to it through the Flexibility Act, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, which was recently approved by Congress and signed by the President, the potential Build Back Better Act that's under consideration. Take all those together, we're going to talk about some funding strategies. If there's time remaining, touch on some compliance issues and answer your questions. So let's turn first to the American Rescue Plan Act and the Flexibility Act. That's a truncated version of a very long bill that's currently being considered. It's actually called the State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Fiscal Recovery, Infrastructure, and Disaster Relief Flexibility Act. You can see why we truncated it to just the Flexibility Act, and I'll go into a little more detail on that here in just a few minutes. So a little refresher for those of you, particularly if you've attended my prior sessions on the American Rescue Plan, just a little refresher to get you warmed up this morning. So the ARP is $1.9 trillion in total to address the global pandemic and the public health emergency created by COVID-19. We tend to focus in our discussions on the assistance to local governments, but the ARP, you might recall, is also the source of various forms of stimulus that we've heard about and read about that include direct assistance to households and businesses as well. The portion of the American Rescue Plan that is in your hands and the hands of other local governments is referred to in the Act as the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. And that totals about $350 billion. You'll see that oftentimes abbreviated as SFRF, or State Fiscal Recovery Funds, or LFRF, Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, or just FRF. I know that tends to throw people sometimes. What's ARP versus FRF? You got the money went out in two tranches. You got one tranche last spring, summer. The next tranche will be coming out in about a year. You have until the end of 2024 to obligate the funds and fully expend them by the end of 2026. And just a reminder, the difference: obligated means you made a promise to pay. Expended means you've actually paid it all out. So you need to basically make an obligation to expend it all by 2024 and then actually have all the funds out of your accounts by 2026. And yes, if you don't spend the money, the Treasury does expect you to return it. So this gives you a breakdown of the fiscal recovery funds that went to local governments, $350 billion in total, as I mentioned previously. The purpose of this graphic is just to remind you that there are a lot of different pots of money intended to benefit local government. And you can see just a quick breakdown on the amount of money that went into each. And this is an important point that we'll come back to as we start to think about strategy. Also keep in mind the state of Missouri also received American Rescue Plan funds, about $2.7 billion. Some of that we expect to trickle down to cities. In fact, the governor has announced an intention to ask the legislature in this upcoming session to make a portion of the state's fiscal recovery funds available to cities, primarily in two areas. One of those is water, sanitary, sewer, and stormwater infrastructure. The intention there, it sounds like, is that these will be need-based with a requirement for local matching funds. I'm presuming they're going to be administered through the drinking water and the clean water state revolving loan funds. And then the other main category is broadband. Again, the announced intention is there will be some form of matching requirement. And of course, those matches for both the water, sewer, and stormwater infrastructure and the broadband, could come from your portion of the fiscal recovery funds. Reminder that we are still working under the interim final rule, and I still think it's an oxymoron to call something both interim and final, but that's Washington speak. But we're still operating under that interim final rule. It took effect in May of this year. Was open to comment. That's closed. About 1,000 unique comments have been received. There was, some expectation that we would have a final rule by now. That hasn't happened. Not entirely clear when exactly we will be getting the final rule. But one thing that I think is noteworthy, and it was, if you may have seen, there was some guidance that recently came out on auditing of the American Rescue Plan. And it made it very clear that when audits are performed on the use of the fiscal recovery funds, the rules that were in effect at the time the expense was made will be the rules that are applied in the audit. So the significance of that is, if you expend the funds now and there's some widening or loosening of the rules later, the rules that will apply will not be those wider or looser rules. They'll be the rules that were applied now. So that's important to keep in mind. As you may recall, the reporting requirements were changed back in November. The deadlines were pushed out quite a bit for basically metropolitan area cities with a population over 250,000 or awards over 10 million. The first reporting will be in January. And then for everyone else, the first reporting is going to be in April of next year. And those of you who are non-entitlement units are still waiting for and should receive sometime soon the instructions on how to access the Treasury's portal and fill out your reports. So watch for that. So the Flexibility Act, as we like to call it, is a bill that has passed the Senate. It was Senate Bill 311. It's now in the House as House Resolution 5735. And it's significant. It reminds me a whole lot of what happened with the CARES Act when there were changing rules that really widened the ability to use the funds for public safety expenditures. This would be if it passes and is signed by the president, be a pretty significant change. Some of the things that it does make clear you can use funds for natural disasters. It opens up use of the funds for infrastructure projects, most notably nationally significant freight and highway projects. So it does introduce some road projects for the first time. And then I think most significantly what it would do is sets that the amount of money that you can use as a result of revenue loss would be either the calculated amount or 10 million, whichever is less. So for those of you who receive less than 10 million in fiscal recovery funds, what that would mean is you could use all of your funds for the same things that are eligible under your revenue loss dollars, which, to remind you, is basically government services. So it's a very wide area, basically anything that's considered government services, anything that is eligible under your revenue loss calculation would become eligible for use of the funds. So this could be a game changer. There was an attempt here just recently to attach the Flexibility Act to a defense bill as a means to get it pushed through fairly quickly. That was ultimately not successful. Our reading of the tea leaves at this point is that this bill is probably dormant until the beginning of next year, but it's got 126 co-sponsors, bipartisan co-sponsors. So, it does seem to have legs, and we're watching it closely. Let's turn to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. So this graphic gives you an idea of where the money goes from the infrastructure bill. You can see that a big portion of it is for highways and bridges, transit, rail. So you can see if you add those first three together, surface transportation is a big part of this bill. Broadband is in there as well. Energy, drinking and wastewater, Western water, wildfire management, dam safety, ports, aviation, economic development, environmental remediation. But you can see kind of the big takeaway here is transportation is truly the lion's share of the bill. Zeroing in on Missouri, it parallels pretty well to the overall bill. So almost $7 billion that Missouri will receive. Oh, I'm sorry. That's just I'm sorry. That's just for highways and bridges. Public transportation, broadband make up the lion's share, as well as a good amount for water and wastewater. So yeah, almost $9 billion in total. So in thinking about the infrastructure bill, you know, it really is time to start planning. The rules for distribution are still being created. There'll be rulemaking, there'll be comment period. We do anticipate that the money is going to go out in various forms. Some of it will be competitive grants, some will be formulaic grants, and then some will just filter through the various federal agencies directly into programs. But to particularly prepare for those competitive grant possibilities, now is really the ideal time to start preparing. And the approach that you want to take is your typical asset management, asset life cycle approach, which we've illustrated here on this graphic. And the place to really be focusing as much as you can is in those first two steps, planning and design. The farther you can push projects through plan and design, including environmental assessment, the closer you will be to the proverbial, shovel-ready project, which will put you heads and shoulders ahead of others as you start to make application for those competitive grants. We, to help our clients, have assembled a very comprehensive database of all of the various funding programs through the Infrastructure Act. We're making that database available to our clients through our comprehensive Compass service, which is designed to help you navigate all of the various bills, American Rescue Plan, Infrastructure Bill, Build Back Better, assuming it passes. There's a link at the end of my presentation that can take you to some more information about that Compass service if you're interested in it. But to give you an idea, I mean, this is the breakdown of just drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. It's so much. There's more on the next slide. There are 16 distinct programs in the Infrastructure Act just related to drinking water and wastewater. And you can kind of scan through these and see the breadth of them. They address all kinds of different things. And so, there's this kind of breakdown of programs for all of the different infrastructure programs within the Infrastructure Act. So the Build Back Better bill is still under consideration. Framework of that was released back in October. It was passed by the House in November. It's currently in the Senate. Senator Schumer has set a goal of passing it by Christmas. We'll see. I think it's reasonable to expect changes. If you've been following it, there's quite a bit of debate. This gives you a snapshot of what's in the bill currently. You can see that childcare and preschool make up a good portion, as does clean energy and climate investments. but there's a potpourri of other things in there: home care, child tax and earned income tax credits, housing, higher ed, immigration, equity, Medicare. Immigration, I think, is maybe the sticking point. There's some questions to whether that really can stay in there, particularly if they're going to pass it in the through the method that they have indicated an intention to do. So we'll see how that plays out. And that's, a whole lot. So let's talk about funding strategies. And as you look at the different bills, it would seem that they're kind of disparate, but there's really a lot of overlap. If you look at the ARP, we've got supporting COVID-19 response, local government, replacing local government revenue, stabilization of households and business, addressing systemic problems in the economy and infrastructure, particularly water, sewer, and broadband. The Flexibility Act would expand that to include, road infrastructure and greater ability to fund government services as well as disaster relief. The infrastructure bill, roads, drinking water, again, internet, broadband, climate, environmental justice, underserved communities, again, a duplicate, ports, airports, rail, and then the Build Back Better, children, caregiving, climate change, again, healthcare coverage. And when I spent a little time with a pad and paper yesterday looking at this, I found a number of what I would call intersections among all the different pieces of legislation. Service transportation shows up multiple times, as does economic development, education, climate change, housing, water, wastewater, broadband, a whole lot of overlap there, environmental remediation, and assistance to households and parts of the community that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So there's a whole lot of intersections there, which really then raises questions of, okay, so how do we make sense of all this, and how do we best navigate it to get the most that we can for our community? And I think the way is to start thinking about this, as comprehensively as you can. For a while, I think our resource allocation processes, budget, capital improvement planning, long-term financial forecasting, at least for a number of years, we're going to need to expand those processes to take into account the potential federal and state funding that will come from all of this legislation. Unless you were working in local government in the 1960s, which I doubt very many people on this call were, we've never experienced a time when federal and state funding made up a significant portion of our municipal budgets. So this is new, but I think it makes sense to start thinking about this as part of our, like I said, our resource allocation processes. I think it was easy, especially when it was just just the American Rescue Plan, to think about it as something that was in addition to our regular resource allocation processes. But I think it's now time to realize this is a multi-year process, and we need to just fold it into the way we prepare our budgets and our capital improvement plans and our long-term financial plans. So it's really going to require a new way of thinking and operating. We may need to incorporate new participants into those processes. I'm thinking specifically of people with expertise in grant pursuit and state and federal agencies. And we also may want to do more regional thinking because there are opportunities here, I think, to make real what were only kind of dreams before in terms of regional solutions. Here's a little to-do list for you to take away. So where do we go from here? Assemble or round out your team, develop your plan. More on that in a moment. Seek funding partners and resources. Use your most restrictive dollars first. Revisit and evaluate your plan regularly, and be prepared to change course. So, and those last two bullets, revisit and evaluate regularly and be prepared to change course, towards that, there are a few things to keep in mind. We're still operating under the interim rule, and at some point we will get a final rule. There may be changes in interpretation that occur, like what we saw with the CARES Act. The Flexibility Act, as we've talked about, could be approved and introduce funding for roads, as well as increase the amount that you can spend on just general government services. The state has yet to make their decisions on the allocation of its Fiscal Recovery Fund dollars. And the rules for the infrastructure bill are still being written and considered. The same process, assuming Build Back Better passes, will have the same rulemaking process to go through for Build Back Better. And there are some real headwinds to implementation that's going to create, that the rollout of all this is going to be slow. The first is there just aren't enough people in the workforce right now to handle all this. Whether it's the federal government, state government, local government, engineering firms, architecture firms, other specialists, we are in the midst of the Great Resignation, and there weren't enough people before. There certainly aren't people now to make all this happen instantaneously. So that in of itself will slow the rollout. And then, as you're all, I'm sure, acutely aware, the pandemic has affected and is still affecting supply chains. And, you can expect that to continue. And so as we all go about, whether it's broadband or water or sewer infrastructure or what have you, as we all go about getting projects in the queue, that's going to stress those supply chains even more. So it really does underscore that this will be a long-term process, and that we should be open to, like I say, revisiting it, revisiting our plans, and being prepared to change course. And towards putting a plan together, would encourage you to think about gathering community input. There's lots of good reasons to do it. It'll help you make better decisions. Definitely helps you address equity and inclusion, transparency, and accountability. How do you do it? Well, pretty much however you want. But you want to tailor it to your community, and every community is going to be a little bit different. And there's a broad continuum of citizen engagement, everything from just holding public meetings to more intensive reaching out through using the internet or surveys or what have you. But there's a broad continuum, but you need to tailor it to what is appropriate for your community. And then one other point that I meant to make is that as you're putting your plan together, I think that scenario planning will win the day. And by scenario planning, what I mean is, there are uncertainties, right? We don't know if certain legislation will pass. We don't know how rules will ultimately be determined. And being able to say, okay, well, if this happens, then we'll do this. But if this doesn't happen, then we'll do that. Having those kind of scenario plans and being nimble as a result of them, I think, is going to be really, really beneficial and put you ahead of the pack. So I'll talk a moment about compliance. One of the things I'm anticipating is that there may be questions about eligibility. I know I talked a lot about that when I was speaking at the regional dinners. And since then, we've had the opportunity to do quite a bit of eligibility work for various clients around the state. And I can tell you that what we're seeing is, eligibility seems to be falling into really just a relatively small handful of the long list of potential expenditure categories. One of the greatest is 1.7, which is capital investments or physical plant changes to public facilities that respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency. And we're seeing a whole host of things that fall into this category, everything from substantial investments in enterprise software, building new buildings, building modifications, other capital equipment. So this one tends to be one of the more flexible expenditure categories. Another one that we're seeing is 2.10, which is aid to nonprofit organizations. A number of our clients are anxious to get money into the hands of nonprofits for them to do good things, particularly for the hardest hit members of their community. So we've seen a lot of activity there. A little bit of activity in 211, aid to tourism, travel, and hospitality. The trick about that one is the way it's worded is it really is intended to address existing tourism, travel, hospitality industry, not so much build new. And so we've had to explore that a little bit with some of our clients. And then just section 5 altogether, which is a number of different expenditure categories addressing infrastructure. So we've seen a lot of activity there. As we've worked with clients, the biggest thing that we see is folks struggling with is identifying what the COVID-19 related harm is to be addressed. It's easier if you figure out first what is the harm you're trying to address, and then how you're going to address that harm. Working backwards sometimes can be a bit challenging if it's like, okay, we want to do this, but now we got to backtrack to trying to a COVID-related harm. So one thing that will help you a whole lot in determining eligibility is if you can very clearly enunciate what is the COVID-related harm that you're seeking to address. So a few just reminders about, in general, about compliance. There's no matching required through the ARPA. Your period of performance, as we talked about, is your costs are eligible, assuming they were incurred after March 3rd of this year. You have till end of 2024 to obligate, the end of December or the end of 2026 to expend. The procurement rules are the same as any other federal award. Basically, if you've got procurement rules, you need to abide by them. If not, then you need to abide by the federal rules. If you happen to produce income, and I haven't seen a whole lot of this, but if you're expending money in a way that produces income, we are looking for some clarification on that. Reporting we've talked about. Sub-recipient monitoring. Actually, on the next slide, I'm going to go into a little more detail on that. And I know that this is a topic that can be a bit confusing. And I'll do my best to explain it, although I'll tell you, I usually rely on some of our trained accountants in our firm to explain this more fully. So let's go ahead and turn to that. So when you're handing out money, it can go to various kind of types of recipients. So the first being, and probably the easiest to understand, is a contractor, right? So let's say you're buying personal protective equipment, and you're buying masks. And so you contract with a firm to buy masks. So that's a contractor, and those are very simple. Sub-recipients are where things get a bit more complicated. So in a sub-recipient situation, what the characteristics that you'll see is that the sub-recipient has a good degree of control over how the funds are spent and helps determine eligibility, helps with the mission. And in that case, there are reporting requirements that you'll need to incorporate into whatever agreement you have with them. Beneficiaries are, where you're handing it to the ultimate beneficiary. So let's say you're doing rental assistance and you're providing it to the person who who will then use that for themselves. And there's not the same kind of reporting requirements as there are for subrecipients. So as I said, subrecipients trigger a number of things. There should be a contract with grant data elements communicated in it. There is monitoring, and that level of monitoring should vary based on the risk assessment, and then an audit reporting review as well. Beneficiaries, the work is mostly upfront in identifying the need and eligibility under that need, but there isn't the same reporting requirements. So some compliance takeaways. Yeah, like I said, it's important to determine your funding source, determine the pandemic-related harm that you're seeking to redress. Documentation is very important. I know for the folks that we're working with, we do a pretty detailed eligibility evaluation that includes a risk assessment that they then can keep in their files should anyone have any questions or challenge the use of funds. Important to determine right up front what type of recipient you've got, a subrecipient, a contractor, or a beneficiary, so that you can make sure you get the proper agreements in place with all of the necessary elements. And then, as I talked about in the regional dinners, the interim final rule includes a long list of potential uses, but the rule is quick to point out, and multiple times points out that it is a non-exhaustive list and that there are other potential uses. And it puts forth what I would call a three-pronged test as to what else is eligible. And that test is, first, what is the COVID-related harm that you're attempting to address? And then how will what you're proposing to spend the money on, how will that address the identified COVID-related harm? And then importantly, how is what you're proposing to do proportional to the need, right? Are we killing the proverbial fly with the proverbial sledgehammer? Is the amount of money being spent proportional to the harm that you're seeking to address? And as you go through all of this, obviously try and minimize your risk, right? I mean, there are no absolutes. The Treasury has been very clear that if you ask them whether something is eligible, you're not going to get an answer. So you're left to come up with what you think are reasonable assumptions and reasonable decisions. And so you'll want to think about risk as you're making your decisions, because as I say, there are no assurances or guarantees. Emily, with that, looks like we do have a little bit of time. Do we have a way to take questions?
Yeah, if so you can do questions several different ways. You can do it in the chat box if you want to type the questions in, and I can relay those, or Tommy, you'll probably be able to see those as well. The Q&A box is also another way that questions can be asked. There's probably too many people on the call to raise your hand and for me to unmute, so we won't do that. But if you want to do questions either two of those ways, I will kind of keep my eye out for that.
Okay. So far, all I see is the appreciation for the Gene Autry music.
Yeah, that's all I see as well. I do see a couple hands going. Okay, here's one that came in through Q&A. Do you have to prove the COVID impact for infrastructure like water/sewer?
So for water, sewer, wastewater, broadband, those are all presumed to be eligible as long as, so water, sewer, stormwater, they're presumed eligible if they would be eligible under the state's revolving loan programs. You don't have to get a loan, but they do need to be eligible for a loan. And so that's the easiest way. Broadband's broadband. If it's broadband, it's presumed to be eligible.
Okay, and then what is the mine/well and sewer cleanup?
That is, as I understand it, and I haven't dug deep into that, but it's basically environmental remediation. So I know there's a good deal of money in the infrastructure bill for brownfields. And I think it kind of falls into that same vein, excuse the pun, of environmental remediation and cleanup.
Okay, there's been a lot of talk about not spending the money until the final rule is issued. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because I meant to touch on that. As I've been working with cities around the state, we seem to be settling into a philosophy of, look, there are some high priority things that are clearly eligible. Let's go ahead and do those. But then we have other things that we'd like to do, maybe not so clearly eligible, and they can wait. So let's let them wait, and build a list. I think having a list of alternatives that you're keeping in your back pocket, maybe a list that even totals more than the actual dollars that you have available because something may fall off, is a good strategy. But again, I'd go back to, I think it's important to start addressing American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill, anything else that comes down the road as part, and during your next budget process, your next capital improvement planning process, through your next long-term financial planning process, start incorporating that in, because you've got plenty of time. There's, and I think better decisions will be made if you're throwing all of this into the mix with all your other resource allocation decisions. But yeah, I think a good strategy is, look, if you've got things that are really, clearly eligible, that are important, that you want to get done, go ahead and get them done, but don't feel, some compulsion that you've got to spend all the money as quickly as possible.
Okay, are police allowed to get premium pay under ARPA as opposed to fire and EMS?
There is a provision in there for premium pay. It applies to all essential workers. So it would apply across police, fire, EMS, any other position with your municipality that you would deem to be an essential worker. Essential workers are essentially people who, by virtue of their duties, come into daily close contact with other people, or who come into daily close contact with things that have been handled by other people. So anybody who fits that is eligible for premium pay.
Okay, where do you go to get the forms to fill out for what you're using the ARPA for?
There aren't any forms. We have created some forms for our clients. We have a questionnaire that we think helps guide them, but there isn't anything that the Treasury or anyone else has put out. I hope that answers the question.
And then there's one in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
Uh,
I can read it too, but.
oh, yeah. Yes. So there is a prohibition on using your fiscal recovery funds as match for other federal dollars. I did learn something interesting here recently. There is an exception to that. You can use your fiscal recovery funds as match for CDBG. And the reason is kind of interesting. So CDBG is considered an income indexed grant source. And because of that, there is an exception there. So you can pair your fiscal recovery funds with CDBG grants, but most other, as far as I know, most other federal programs, you can't use your fiscal recovery funds as match. Now, that's another place where maybe it makes sense to wait and see how the rules fall out. Also, whether the Flexibility Act is deemed to have loosen that up at all, because those funds are now considered government services. But yeah, I think I sense the spirit of the question. It is frustrating that there is that limitation.
Okay, I think that's it. Tom, thank you so much for being with us this morning. If any other questions come up, if you want to email those to me, I can get them to Tom, or you can, I think Tom has had his contact information out there as well.
Right.
So,
well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Hopefully this was helpful for everybody.
yeah, thanks. Everybody have a great day.
Bye now.
Bye.